Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show that extracts the essential insight from complex ideas.
Today, we are tackling a topic that I think for a lot of people might sound maybe a little dry on the surface.
That's putting it mildly. We're talking about knowledge organization, or KO, but I promise you, this is the invisible architecture that governs really almost everything you do.
It really is, from how your university is structured to, the quality of the results you get from any search engine you use.
And we are diving deep into the theoretical foundations of KO today, guided by a pretty foundational work from Birger Hjørland.
And that's a necessary perspective shift, I think, for you listening, because when most people hear knowledge organization, they immediately think of, what? The Dewey Decimal System?
Right, filing cabinets, maybe some obscure indexing rules. They just associate it very narrowly with library and information science, or LIS.
Exactly. But the fundamental premise of our source material today is that this narrow view is, frankly, intellectually crippling.
So KO isn't just a branch of cataloging.
Not at all. It's a vast interdisciplinary field. And it's rooted deep in philosophy. It's about how we organize, well, the world itself.
Okay, so we're hitting on the core problem right from the get-go then. The scope is massive, but the practice, or at least the perception of the practice, feels kind of tiny.
That's the central tension.
So what exactly is this huge, broad definition of knowledge organization that you're saying LIS has traditionally overlooked?
Well, the broad view is it's staggering in its scope, really. The argument is that KO happens everywhere there's structure.
Everywhere.
Pretty much. Think about the social division of labor, how knowledge gets broken up into disciplines like sociology, chemistry, or art history.
That dictates how universities are built, right? Which
Yeah.
departments sit where all the funding goes.
Precisely. It also involves social institutions, the very structure of our languages, our conceptual system, scientific theories, literatures, genres. It's all KO.
So knowledge organization is an act of creation that starts, well, it starts long before a book even gets a spine label.
Long before. When an ancient society decides to classify animals based on where they live, air, land, water, versus how they evolved.
Mammal, reptile, fish, that kind of thing.
Exactly. That is a fundamental act of knowledge organization.
And the narrow LIS focus, the organization of information in, say, bibliographical records or indexes or on the internet, that's just one application of these broader systems that already exist.
It's just one application. LAS focuses on constructing and utilizing those specific records, but the conceptual heavy lifting has often already been done elsewhere.
That brings up a really critical relationship, then, between the system and the user. The source talks about the central actors, knowledge producers, users, and intermediaries.
Right.
How does their interaction govern whether a system is actually successful or not?
The key factor here is something the source calls pre-understanding.
Pre-understanding.
Yeah. Every single user comes to an information system with a conceptual framework already installed in a way. It's acquired during their professional socialization.
So a physicist already thinks like a physicist. They understand the terminology, the disciplinary structures, almost intuitively.
Exactly. And if the classification system, which is the intermediary's tool, doesn't align with that physicist's pre-understanding, the system fails. It doesn't matter how technically efficient it is.
So the information professional is kind of a translator. They're mediating between the conceptual organization the author created and the one the user expects.
That's a perfect way to put it. And this leads directly to the core indictment of the field that the source lays out.
Which is, if KO is so foundational, so important, why does the library and information science field often seem so fragmented and, well, lacking a unified theoretical core?
Yeah, Hjørland is quite explicit in his critique here. He says, for over a century, since Dewey's system first showed up in 1876, LIS has developed these highly sophisticated standards and rules.
Like Cutter's rules for cataloging or Ranganathan's facet analysis.
The canonical stuff, exactly. But what LIS has failed to do is accumulate theoretical knowledge about the fundamental concepts.
So we don't have a unified research-based consensus on what a concept even is, or how to define criteria for class inclusion, or the real meaning of indexing.
That's the argument. The standards are good, but the underlying science is weak.
So what's been driving the changes then, if not research?
Well, the source suggests that the development in practice has been much more influenced by progress in information technology.
Not by progress in KO itself.
Right. And this exposes a theoretical crisis. When the technology shifts, say you move from punch cards to the internet, The LIS principles struggle to transform.
Because they were built for the platform, not based on some robust platform-independent theory.
Exactly. The field has been reactive, not self-directed by its own research.
Okay, so if the fragmentation is a result of technology driving the practice, let's trace that history. The source suggests there are 5 distinct stages, right?
Yes, 5 stages. And the crucial point is that they coexist and compete. They don't just neatly replace one another.
So it's not a clean evolution, it's more of a messy pileup of different traditions.
It's a very messy pileup. These 5 stages really outline the trajectory of KO specifically within the LIS environment, and they show how these external technological or social pressures created separate, often conflicting traditions.
Okay, so let's start with stage A, the foundation.
Stage A is the one we touched on, manual indexing and classification. This really professionalized around 1876 with figures like Dewey, Cutter, Bliss, Ranganathan.
The Mount Rushmore of library science.
You could say that. They established the great classifications and the core cataloging rules that, still form the backbone of libraries globally.
But even in this foundational stage, there was an immediate and pretty profound critique of its theoretical basis. The source mentions Fromm's critique of Dewey.
Yes, from 1994, he called it harmful, empty formalism.
Harmful, empty formalism. That's a strong phrase. What do you mean by that? He said Dewey reduced subjects to standardized bureaucratic software.
It's a really powerful criticism of how DDC, the Dewey Decimal Classification, was adopted and implemented. Fromm argued that the system was treated as a purely administrative tool.
A way to manage the logistics of the library, as if it were a corporation.
Precisely. And in doing so, it completely ignored the semiotic nature of classification.
Semiotic meaning. The study of signs and meaning.
Exactly. Classification, at its heart, is about assigning meaning. It's a language, it's a sign system. But by reducing subjects to these fixed numbers, DDC focused on locatability and administrative standardization. It just neglected the theoretical imperative to reflect the genuine conceptual relationships within the knowledge itself.
So the resulting principles, like Cutter's rules, they were treated more like sacred canons, not principles that you can research and revise.
Exactly. They became standards of professional conduct, not scientific hypotheses, and this really set the stage for the fragmentation that was to come.
Because when new technological pressures came along, LIS didn't have the theoretical muscle to integrate them.
So they just developed parallel systems. Which brings us to stage B.
Right. Stage B, documentation and scientific communication, starting around 1895. This is where the goals began to diverge pretty sharply.
Very sharply. This stage was driven by the huge increase in scientific publishing. Founders like Paul Otlet and Henri Lafontaine realized that DDC was just too broad for the detailed needs of science and technology.
So they needed something more granular.
Much more. They developed the Universal Decimal Classification, or UDC, for deeper subject analysis. And this created a profound sociological rift.
The documentalists versus the traditional librarians.
Exactly.
So where did their focuses diverge? What was the big difference?
Well, traditional librarians often focused on the humanities and broader cultural objectives, emphasizing collection access and cultural preservation.
And documentalists?
The documentalists were laser-focused on efficient scientific communication, specific subject retrieval, the industrial application of knowledge.
So they realized indexing entire books just wasn't going to cut it.
Right. They had to index single articles, technical reports, specialized literature, and this practical necessity led directly to the founding of serious user studies and the birth of bibliometrics.
Through figures like Bradford and Bernal.
Correct. They really laid the conceptual groundwork for what would become our modern online bibliographic databases.
That makes perfect sense. The scientific need for precision drove a very specialized, more technological solution. And stage C, which is information storage and retrieval by computers from the 1950s onward, that took the technological focus to a whole new level.
To an extreme, really. This stage introduced the theoretical confusion that I think still plagues the field to this day.
How so?
LIS began to confuse its primary goal, which is optimizing the utilization of documented knowledge with the goal of computer science.
Which is constructing efficient algorithms and processing data.
Exactly. And the field shifted its focus from the document to information.
That seems like a subtle change in wording, but it's a huge philosophical difference, isn't it?
It's monumental. The document inherently forces you to think about meaning, language, knowledge, epistemology.
But information.
Information drives you toward control theory, coding, noise reduction, feedback loops. It's a completely different paradigm.
Hmm.
And the resulting methodologies were highly experimental, measuring things like recall and precision, and they emphasized statistical models.
And this is where that empiricist or atomist tendency really took hold.
Yes, the drive to automate KO led to a rejection of what they saw as metaphysically based, deep classification structures.
In favor of what?
In favor of breaking knowledge down into the smallest possible searchable units. They championed these atomist subject access points, or SAPs. A prime example is the uniterm system.
Could you explain for our listeners what the uniterm system was? How does it illustrate that atomist approach?
Sure. The uniterm system, developed by Mortimer Taub, was designed for what's called coordinate indexing. So instead of relying on these pre-coordinated complex classification numbers like in DDC.
Where the relationships were already built in.
Right. Instead of that, it used single significant keywords, or uniterms, that were extracted from the document. The idea was that the user could then combine these single atomized terms at the time of the search.
So the coordination happens at the user's end.
Exactly. This was very efficient for computer processing at the time, but the underlying philosophy was this reductionist belief that the length of the searchable record was the most important parameter. It seriously neglected the qualitative differences that human interpretation brings, favoring simple word mashes over any kind of conceptual hierarchy.
So if stage C was all about these surface keywords, stage D seems like a direct reaction. This is citation-based retrieval, starting from 1963.
It was a huge reaction, and it offered a much deeper, hidden insight. Eugene Garfield's Science Citation Index was revolutionary.
Why? What did it do differently?
It introduced the concept of document networks. Citations supplemented the old term-based retrieval and revealed a really complex truth. Subject relatedness often has absolutely nothing to do with shared keywords.
Meaning, two papers could be talking about the exact same topic, but if they're rooted in competing theories, let's say one is behaviorist and one is psychoanalytic, they might not cite each other, even if they share keywords.
Precisely. And conversely, two papers could share 0 keywords, but be highly relevant and often cited together because they both rely on the same new theoretical advance.
So citation analysis revealed that semantic relations can be implicit, they can be latent, and they're determined by theoretical advances within a discipline, not by the surface language.
Yes. And this forced a fundamental reevaluation of the goals of information retrieval, or IR.
Because if the classification reflects the theoretical structure, then the goal can't just be predicting what an individual user might want.
Right, because individual use is messy.
How so?
Well, it's often driven by social psychological motives. You might cite a competitor to criticize them or cite a friend out of flattery. If you base your IR ideals on those motives, your systems become completely unstable.
So what's the alternative?
Stage D forced the realization that the goal of IR should be rooted in epistemological principles for the advancement of public knowledge. The system has to fulfill the norms of good science.
That's a much higher bar.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the final stage, stage E, full text, hypertext, and the internet from the 1990s onward.
Right. And here's the ultimate challenge.
If the entire document is available and literally every word is a potential subject access point, why do we need human intervention at all? Why do we need indexers?
This is the ultimate hurdle in this theoretical crisis. If a scholar like Klaus Poulsen suggests the subject is just transparently given in the literature, then human indexing, which is expensive and slow, seems redundant.
But Hjørland counters this.
Vehemently. He counters this by defining the subject as the document's epistemological or informative potentialities.
Potentialities, meaning the implicit knowledge, the things that aren't right there on the surface.
Yes. And this definition validates the expertise of the information professional. It establishes the necessity of value-added indexing that goes way beyond simple keyword extraction.
So the professional has to identify implicit meanings, latent functions.
Or even, and this is critical, correct-wrong self-representations made by the author.
This is where we need that powerful, maybe extreme example that's cited in the source material to really make the point clear.
Right. The example is that of indexing Nazi literature about Jews. If the Nazi author titles the work A Scientific Study of the Jewish Problem, indexing it purely by its keywords or its title is, well, it's dangerously misleading.
It's insufficient for an information seeker who needs the actual historical context.
Absolutely. The professional is obligated to index it as Nazi propaganda about Jews. The value-added step here is recognizing the document's true epistemological potential, its true informative nature, which is vital for the user seeking reliable, contextually grounded information.
So that's why human interpretation remains crucial, even in the age of massive full-text retrieval.
It's the last line of defense against decontextualization.
That historical overview really clarifies the crisis caused by this fragmented technology-driven practice. So let's pivot now to the theory that tries to unify the field. The distinction between organizing the concepts versus organizing the people who use them.
Right. This takes us away from algorithms and into the structure of society itself.
This is the difference between what the source calls the intellectual or cognitive organization and the social organization of knowledge.
Exactly. Intellectual organization focuses on the internal structure of knowledge itself, conceptual systems, theories. Think of the logical arrangement of the periodic table, or how we define species in zoology.
And a social organization is external. It's
Right.
based on human groupings.
Right. Professions, trades, and most importantly, academic disciplines. And the central insight here is that traditional library classification systems, like DDC, are fundamentally social.
Meaning they prioritize the structure of the university and the academic division of labor over the inherent structure of reality.
That's a great way to put it.
You mentioned the classic water example earlier. Let's expand on that. If I'm doing a search for water, a conceptually driven system might group all the documents about water together. Why does DDC scatter them all over the place?
DDC scatters them precisely because it's adhering to that social model. If a work is about the chemical composition of water, it goes under chemistry.
If it's about legal ownership of water rights, it goes under law.
If it's about the religious use of water, it goes under religion. DDC prioritizes the discipline studying the subject rather than the subject itself.
And this disciplinary division, which seems kind of arbitrary from a purely conceptual standpoint, is argued to be critical for optimal information seeking.
It is for a certain kind of user. When a specialized user, like a chemist, approaches the system, half the retrieval battle is already won if the system forces them to identify the disciplinary context of their query.
So DDC is efficient for specialized disciplinary searches.
Exactly. But it highlights that foundational tension. The classification reflects the structure of the institution more than the structure of reality.
That tension leads us straight into these deep philosophical frameworks. Science as a mirror versus science as a map.
Right. The mirror metaphor, which is rooted in rationalism, suggests that our concepts and theories are just neutral reflections of an objective reality.
So knowledge organization, in this view, is separate from all the messiness of the social division of labor. The system just mirrors what is.
That's the idea. But then you have the map metaphor, which is rooted in pragmatism.
And that views concepts and fields as useful tools, as maps that are constructed to serve human goals and accommodate the demands of life.
And since a map is always designed for a specific activity, a subway map is different from a geological map, the intellectual organization is deeply, inextricably linked to the social organization.
The goals, the interests, the activities that the map is serving.
All of it.
So which perspective does the source argue provides the necessary foundation for modern KO?
Hjørland advocates for what he calls pragmatic realism, which is really the necessary compromise. Well, it avoids the pitfall of sociological reductionism, the idea that classifications are only social constructions that just serve self-interest. Pragmatic realism accepts that concepts are tools, but it insists that those tools have to be constrained and evaluated by their efficacy in the real world.
You have to be good tools for the job. They can't just be arbitrary.
Exactly.
Let's elaborate on the need for this middle ground, maybe using the example of psychological classification. This involves concepts like Einheitspsychose. Am I saying that right?
Einheitspsychose, yeah, unitary psychosis. So if you look at how we classify mental illness, a purely sociological view might say our current systems are just heavily influenced by cultural and social interests, that the concepts are just social constructions.
But experimental researchers would push back on that.
They would. They'd ask if a concept like schizophrenia is a fruitful etiological concept, meaning does it relate to the actual causal origin of the disease?
Okay, so for our listeners, what is the core idea of Einheitspsychose, and why does it challenge a traditional classification like the DSM?
So Einheitspsychose is this historical idea, it was prominent in 19th century German psychiatry, that all the major psychoses, what we now call schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, share a single common genetic basis or underlying mechanism.
The idea being that they're fundamentally the same disease, just manifesting in different ways.
Exactly. Now, if that theory were proven true today, then our long-standing classification that treats them as separate categories, like in the DSM, would be rendered empirically invalid.
Even if it's still administratively convenient.
Right. And pragmatic realism requires us to evaluate that classification based on its ability to help us understand causation and find cures. If the schizophrenia classification prevents us from seeing a common genetic root, then it's a bad tool, regardless of how culturally established it is.
So our final classification has to be a tool that works best for human prediction and action.
That's the standard.
Okay, moving on to the broader context of who handles all this knowledge, the sociological ecosystem. The source uses the Unisys model to visualize this division of labor.
The Unisys model provides that vital sociological framework. It defines the three main actors: knowledge producers,
Researchers, authors,
knowledge users,
the audience.
and intermediaries, information specialists, librarians, publishers. It also defines the institutions, like libraries and research centers, and the whole flow of documentation.
And crucially, this model establishes a meaningful typology of literature based on its function.
Yes. Primary services, which are your original journals and publishers. Secondary services, which are the bibliographical databases and abstracts. And tertiary services, reviews, encyclopedias, that kind of thing.
And what does this sociological view clarify about the professional role of the information specialist? This seems important.
It solidifies the distinction between the subject expert and the information expert. Information specialists are experts in the communication of published documents.
How to index them, retrieve them, structure the flow of knowledge.
Right. They are not necessarily experts in the primary subject matter itself. An astronomer interprets the stars. An information expert interprets and indexes the documents about the astronomer's findings.
And that clear division of labor is essential to avoid the theoretical confusion we talked about back in Stage C,
where LIS mistakenly tried to merge itself with the subject matter or with computer science. This model keeps everyone in their proper lane, so to speak.
Okay, so when we take the knowledge generated by these specialists and we digitize it, we reduce the document to electronic text. As we discussed, a term just becomes a string of characters divorced from its original context.
You lose so much.
So how do we reestablish that context in electronic retrieval, especially for our subject access points, or SAPs?
The loss of context in digital retrieval is enormous. You lose the context of the journal it was published in, the section of the text it appeared in, the intended audience. LIS has to study how context provides meaning.
For instance, a term appearing in the title should carry a different semantic weight than the same term appearing in the footnotes.
Of course. A term in the methodology section has a very different function than the same term in the discussion section. What we're trying to do is formalize the tacit knowledge of a competent database user.
Someone who knows the literature and the disciplinary language.
Right. That user instinctively knows that a concept mentioned in the title of a top-tier specialized journal is likely central to the entire document. But if it's only mentioned in a single paragraph under future research, its importance shifts entirely.
So the information expert's job is to make those unspoken linguistic principles explicit in the system.
That's the goal.
Okay, let's review the three major concurrent approaches to IR and KO that the source identifies, because they show very different ways of dealing with this context problem.
The first is the simple statistical approach. Traditional IR. This is based purely on term frequencies in the text and in the database as a whole. It's highly internal to the document.
The second is citation basis, which we talked about in Stage D.
Right. And this approach is highly sociological and theoretical. It's based on those document networks and citation patterns. It's external to the surface language of the document, but internal to the disciplinary activity.
And the third approach is the classic one, traditional library classifications.
Systems like DDC and UDC. These are built on established disciplinary divisions that are, by principle, external to the documents being indexed.
Why is that external nature so crucial?
Because it means you cannot derive the classification structure from the documents themselves. To classify a collection of documents about Spain, you can't just look at the documents. You need external geographical concepts, political concepts, historical concepts.
Which you get from geography, political science, history.
Exactly. If you only use internal statistical analysis of your collection, you risk creating a system that simply reflects the accidents of what you happen to own, not the necessary conceptual structure of the world. The traditional approach forces you to apply external accumulated knowledge onto the documents.
Shifting to the nature of language itself, the source references social semiotics and the Helmslove figure, showing how classification is just baked into the languages we speak.
Yeah, this refers to the structuralist view that the language we learn inherently structures how we understand the world. Louise Hjelmslev highlighted that semantic boundaries are culturally relative.
How so?
The way English divides the semantic space for words like tree, wood, and forest is completely arbitrary compared to how German or Danish or French divides that same reality into concepts.
Well, when you learn German, you're not just learning new words for things.
You're learning a new way to classify natural reality. And this means that all our KO systems are built on top of these pre-existing, non-neutral linguistic classifications.
This leads directly to activity theory, or AT, and the concept of teleology. If language and classification are tools, they can't be arbitrary. They have to be goal-directed.
Exactly. We should probably define activity theory here. It's a framework that views signs, meanings, and documents as tools that are developed to function in relation to standardized practices within a community.
Like the specialized vocabulary of medical charting, or the highly formalized language of law.
Perfect examples. They aren't arbitrary. They are precise tools designed for very specific activities, healing, litigation.
So teleology means that everything is defined by its intended end goal, its purpose.
That is the core of the pragmatic argument. Any name, any subject access point, any classification choice is inherently teleological. When we assign a SAP, we facilitate some uses of that document, the intended ones, while at the same time making other unintended uses more difficult.
Which means no terminology or KO technology can ever be truly neutral.
Never. It is always optimized to serve a specific set of functions.
This is a really critical takeaway for anyone using or building a system. If the system isn't neutral, what objective metric can we possibly use to define its goodness?
Relevance must always be tied to a goal. If you're asked to judge if a document is relevant, you have to first ask, relevant to what goal?
And the source gives a very strict definition.
It does, and it's rooted in pragmatism. Something A is relevant to a task, T, if it increases the likelihood of accomplishing the goal, G, which is implied by T.
So if the classification choice helps a surgeon find a document that leads to a successful operation, then the system is objectively good.
And if it leads to failure, it is objectively bad, irrespective of how aesthetically pleasing the index terms might be.
We've established that the goal determines relevance. Now we move to the fundamental principle of classification, bringing things together. But the source makes it abundantly clear that defining likeliness or similarity is, well, it's not simple at all.
It's the central problem. Classification is not passive observation. It is theory implementation.
And this is where Thomas Kuhn's concept of paradigms comes in.
Right. Paradigms are these systems of basic assumptions and epistemic ideals that define the world the knowledge lives in. If you're indexing physics, you're operating within a highly unified Newtonian or quantum paradigm. The rules are pretty clear.
But the source notes that many social sciences are what he calls preparadigmatic.
Yeah, characterized by careful mutual avoidance. Competing theoretical schools like behaviorism and humanistic psychology exist side by side, but they rarely engage in direct confrontation.
And that lack of confrontation destabilizes classification.
Because the underlying structure is constantly being contested.
So the units of KO, the concepts, and the semantic relations between concepts, they're never just isolated facts.
They are entirely theory embedded. To know if concept A is narrower than concept B, you have to appeal to some theory. Concepts are not just lists of features or statistical correlations.
And this is Frank Keel's insight, right? That they're intertwined with coherent belief systems, or theories, that explain their internal structure.
Exactly. And this fundamentally challenges the naive realism that drove so much of that early automated KO research. The belief that things are just what they look like on the surface.
Keel's insight proves that scientific classification has to be based on deeper causal theories, not just immediate sensory appearances.
And we have historical evidence that surface similarity is often scientifically misleading.
This is where we have to elaborate on the Wales's fish example, because it perfectly illustrates the failure of just relying on surface observation.
It's the perfect example. For almost 2,000 years, from Aristotle onward, whales were classified with fish. Why? Because they were large, lived in the water, and had fins.
They exhibited immediate, salient visual similarity.
It's a purely observational classification. It took the development of evolutionary theory, embryology, and internal causal theories to correctly classify them as mammals.
Based on their reproductive and respiratory systems, things you can't see from the outside.
Right. This was a discovery that forced a complete overhaul of the classification scheme. If an automated system in the year 500 AD relied purely on statistical analysis of word features or user opinions, it would overwhelmingly confirm that whales are fish.
Which underscores the huge risk of those atomist empiricist classification methods.
Absolutely. The classification of mercury as a metal or water as a chemical compound. These aren't decisions based on how they look, but on discoveries about their internal causal structure. This means the human indexer or system designer has to appeal to the current best scientific theory of the domain, not just the raw data in the document.
And this theoretical allegiance makes all the semantic relations is part of, narrower term, inherently relative. They aren't fixed truths.
They are entirely relative to the theory you choose. We can go back to that psychological example, the relationship between schizophrenia, manic depressive disorders, and psychosis.
It depends entirely on which theory you subscribe to.
It does. If you accept the Einheitspsychose, or unitary psychosis theory, then the former two are not narrower terms of psychosis. They're basically synonyms for a single underlying phenomenon.
But if you adhere to the traditional Kraepelinian dichotomy,
then they are distinct narrower terms. The classification choice you make is a theoretical commitment.
so since classification is inherently an act of choice based on theory or purpose, let's synthesize the different criteria the source material provides for defining this likeliness.
We can distinguish between about 6 main motivations for grouping things together.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, you have logical criteria. This is based on formal rules like generic subordination. Institutions for information science are a subtype of institutions.
No.
It relies on logical relations that are inherent in language or set theory.
Straightforward enough. What's second?
Second, conventional or social criteria. This is based purely on human agreement and social arrangements. The classic example is political boundaries. Copenhagen is part of Denmark. The similarity isn't physical, it's purely institutional and conventional.
Okay, third.
Third, and this is a big one, theoretical or scientific criteria. These are the profound, necessary classifications based on domain-specific scientific discoveries, like evolutionary theory forcing the reclassification of whales. This is the goal when you're classifying natural kinds.
Number 4 gets a bit more political, doesn't it?
It does. Fourth is professional interests or paradigm battles. Here, classification reflects allegiance and, frankly, turf wars. The classification of psychology as a natural science in one university, a social science in another, or a humanities subject in a third. That reflects the theoretical battles between behaviorist and humanistic schools. The structure serves the organizational interests of the dominant paradigm.
Right, and fifth.
Fifth, empirical generalizations. These criteria try to avoid those uncomfortable theoretical issues and rely instead on observable, reproducible statistical findings. A great example is the universality of basic color terms discovered by Berlin and Kay. This is the statistical correlation approach, which is really common in empiricist KO.
And finally, the last one.
And finally, number 6, accidental or ad hoc classifications. These serve a very specific, temporary purpose and are optimized only for that single task. They can be useful in the moment, but they rarely contribute to a robust, long-term knowledge structure.
This detailed breakdown just proves that classification is so far from being a simple administrative task. It's this constant synthesis of logic, convention, science, and professional politics.
It's all of those things at once.
So if the criteria for similarity are so diverse, it implies that the methods we use to build these classification systems must also be varied. And the source concludes that all methods of KO ultimately connect back to one of 4 fundamental epistemological views.
That is the ultimate theoretical framework that's offered. All KO systems, whether they know it or not, adhere to a philosophical tradition. But first, we have to clear up some non-fundamental distinctions that often confuse practitioners.
What are those?
First, we have to reject the standardization method as a fundamental philosophical basis. When a classification system is declared a standard just through compromise between experts, its quality rests on authority, on authoritarianism, not on scientific validity or investigation.
And the distinction between computer methods and intellectual methods is also artificial.
It's completely artificial. The real distinction is not the agent, whether it's a human or a machine, but the type of rules or knowledge being applied. If the rules are explicit and computable, either agent can apply them. The real line is defined by whether the knowledge is deep, theoretical, and non-computable, or if it's quantitative and processable.
So the quantitative versus qualitative distinction is also a weak one.
It is. Quantitative methods like statistical clustering require qualitative judgment to set the initial categories, and qualitative analysis can lead to measurable categories. They're not fundamentally opposed.
So let's focus on the four real, fundamental epistemological views that inform how we choose to classify the world. Let's start with empiricism.
Empiricism is based on simple observations, sensory data, and statistical generalizations. The underlying philosophical view, nominalism, holds that concepts are merely names we assign to classes of things that happen to share observed features. It denies any deeper, inherent structure.
What does that look like in practice, in scientific classification?
In science, it manifests in systems like the DSM-IV for mental illness, where disorders are grouped based on a clustering of observed symptoms and test scores rather than confirmed etiological causes.
And in bibliographic KO?
It's the entire tradition of traditional IR algorithms. Document clustering based on common terms, bibliographical coupling, statistical co-occurrence. Think of how a basic Google keyword search works. It's a fundamentally empiricist approach, relying on what words are present and how frequent they are.
Okay, so the opposite end of that spectrum is rationalism.
Right. Rationalism relies on principles of pure reason, deduction, and universal logical divisions. The belief here is that concepts are either inborn or they mature naturally, and that a single, universal logical structure can be imposed on all knowledge.
Where do we see that?
You see it in pure, deductive artificial intelligence, those old frame-based systems, or in linguistics, like Chomsky's analysis of a universal language deep structure. In KO, the supreme example is facet analysis, championed by Ranganathan and later Bliss-Tuer.
What's the idea there?
Those systems attempt to build classifications out of what they see as eternal and unchangeable categories. Things like personality, matter, energy, space, time based on logical, deductive division. It's a search for a universal logic that transcends the messy reality of scientific discovery or social conventions.
Okay, our third view is historicism.
Historicism emphasizes the importance of context, development, and evolutionary history. Pre-understanding and the existing structure of the social community play major roles.
And in science?
Scientific classification based on historicism includes biological taxonomies built strictly on evolutionary history, or the classification of the sciences themselves based on how they historically emerged and organized themselves.
And critically, the structure of the Dewey Decimal Classification.
It adheres perfectly to the historicist ideal. It reflects the historical, organizational divisions of knowledge as established by 19th century universities. And you could also argue that citation analysis, stage D, is inherently historicist since it maps the evolution of theoretical communities over time.
And finally, the framework that Hjørland seems to prioritize. Pragmatism.
Right. Pragmatism is the teleological method. It's based on the analysis of goals, values, and consequences. The question is always, what is this system for? This leads to classifications based on specific values or policies.
So a feminist epistemology, for example, might identify similarity not by inherent scientific properties, but by the function of a concept as it relates to a goal, like emancipation.
Exactly. And in bibliographic KO, this results in systems based on cultural warrant, or what the source calls critical or political classification. For example, a system designed specifically for an activist archive might group documents based on their political utility or their contribution to a specific social movement's goals, not strictly by their academic discipline or scientific content.
But this brings up the danger we raised earlier. It sounds arbitrary. If I just classify things based on my personal goals, how do we prevent sociological reductionism from running wild?
That is the absolute necessity of pragmatic realism. John Dewey, a key pragmatic thinker, acknowledged that a cherry tree can be classified differently by an orchardist, a woodworker, and an artist.
The orchardist is focused on fruit production, the woodworker on timber, the artist on aesthetic value.
And each classification is useful and valid if the difference in their ends is borne in mind. However, and this is the key, Dewey insisted there is a genuine objective standard for the goodness of these special classifications.
Lessa.
Reality provides empirical and theoretical constraints. If the botanist's classification is based on a theory that, when you act on it, leads to diseased, non-fruiting trees, then that classification is objectively bad. Its failure is observable and real.
So the goodness of a classification is objectively measured by whether it furthers successful action for its intended end. This has been a truly comprehensive dive. We've exposed knowledge organization as this continuous philosophical battlefield.
It really is.
We've moved from realizing that LIS is fragmented by 5 competing technological traditions, from manual indexing all the way to full-text search, to understanding that the foundational choices we make are rooted in these four fundamental epistemological viewpoints.
Whether we choose to prioritize logic, observation, history, or goals, the semantic relations we choose are never neutral.
And the central lesson is that these classification systems are not passive reflections of a finished reality.
They are living, goal-directed tools. They are defined, above all else, by the purpose they are meant to achieve in the world. As technology makes information search more powerful and simultaneously less contextualized, that professional act of assigning context, of defining a document's epistemological potentiality.
That becomes a vital theoretical defense against misinformation and intellectual chaos.
It really does.
So, as you encounter a classification out there in the wild, whether it's the structure of an academic journal, the categories on your corporate intranet, or the subjects on a streaming platform, you should ask yourself, what job is this classification trying to do?
Is it trying to mirror an objective truth, which would be rationalism? Is it clustering based on what's popular or what's on the surface, which is empiricism?
Is it reflecting the long history of this profession? That's historicism. Or is it overtly pushing a set of specific goals? Pragmatism.
Right. Our classifications are not descriptions of what is, but tools aimed at what is to come. As the American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce, one of the founders of pragmatism, wisely stated, the rational meaning of every proposition lies in the future. It's connected to future conduct and self-control.
So our systems of classification are not a bare transcript of some pre-existing arrangement in nature.
Instead, they must be viewed as, and I love this quote, a repertory of weapons for attack upon the future and the unknown. So think about what problems the classifications you rely on are truly optimized to solve for tomorrow.